When Bumming plunged from the lighting bridge in the rehearsal hall of the Opera Academy, his left hand was locked around a gongche notation book, a handwritten score in the ancient Chinese musical notation system. The person who pushed him was Cheng Nianqing. She was the Dan actress, a female role specialist he had raised since the affiliated high school, the disciple to whom he had devoted 17 years, teaching everything from stage walking to water sleeve technique. At the Chinese Theatre Plum Blossom Award ceremony, he had stood before a national audience and called her the most perfect guimandan I have ever seen in my life, the refined young lady role, the jewel of Kunku opera. As he fell, when saw Cheng adjust her kingfisher feather headdress with a hand still sheathed in a water sleeve, her movements composed, as though she were completing a flawless curtain call. Under the cold glare of a follow spot, her eyes tracked his accelerating fall with no anger, no murderous intent, only a precisely calculated relief, as if she had just deleted an outdated old aria. When Bumming's back tore through the rehearsal hall's sound-dampening drapery, crashed through a prop rack on the second-floor catwalk, and finally slammed into a heap of crash mats, his spine exploded into a burst fracture at the 11th vertebra. 7 ribs broke. A skull fracture claimed the hearing in his left ear forever. His left hand still clutched the notation book. The impact tore its binding, yellowed pages of mulberry paper scattered across the floor like white butterflies with broken wings in the dawn light streaming through tall windows. One page landed on his face. On it, meticulous regular script calligraphy detailed the most famous stage directions for the peony pavilions. A dream interrupted the brilliant purples and reds that bloomed so profusely / all abandoned to this crumbling well and broken walls. Beside every character, crimson annotations marked the precise angle of the water sleeves, the exact dimensions of each step, the specific landing point of every gaze. The red notes looked like codes written in blood. It was the complete performing system for Kunku's guimandan that he had spent half a lifetime compiling, over 400 pages covering body movement, singing, facial expression, and costume design for every classic guimandan role from the Southern Song dynasty to the early Republic. It had never been published. Only this single handwritten manuscript existed. On its final page, in the same vermilion ink, was a line, "This score is to be passed to those with fate." The way of Shitsu opera is oral transmission from heart to heart. It must not break in my hands. What Cheng Nianqing didn't know was that 3 minutes before she pushed him, when Bumming had already uploaded a complete digital scan of the Crane Garden performing system to an anonymous cloud node, the file had a 72-hour silent countdown. If one didn't manually cancel it, it would automatically send to the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee, the Chinese National Academy of Arts, and the editorial departments of 3 leading global theater journals. The version Cheng had stolen was a forgery in which critical rhythmic data for body movement had been altered. In the week before the fall, when had sensed something wrong, Cheng had been staying late alone, claiming she was rehearsing a new production, but the rehearsal hall's security logs showed her entry and exit times didn't match the extra hours she reported. Once, when deliberately left a movement score with deliberately wrong rhythmic markings on the rehearsal hall table, the next day those exact errors appeared in Cheng's private rehearsal notes. He couldn't bear to believe the student he had raised with his own hands could turn on him, yet he made backups anyway. He broke the true performance system into countless encrypted fragments and scattered them across different servers. It was a habit born in his youth at the Kunku Transmission Institute, when all gongche scores were hand-copied and a single fire could incinerate a whole school's centuries of work. He had once seen an old master weep all night in the little room behind the stage because his lone, hand-copied score, an irreplaceable treasure, had been devoured by termites and reduced to powder. The old man fell ill the next day and never rose again. After that, one always made multiple copies of every precious document. Every manuscript was traced with carbon paper into 3 copies stored in different places, one in the iron cabinet in the rehearsal hall, one in a camphor chest beneath his bed at home, and one sent to Yen Mubai for safekeeping. When Bumming lay on the crash mat, blood from his left ear soaking into the spongy crevices. The mat was old, its foam long drained of elasticity, its surface printed with the sweat and tear stains of generations of performers, faded, layered imprints like a washed-out inkwash painting. Above him he heard applause and laughter from the rehearsal hall. The whole Kunku company was celebrating Qing Nianqing's newly bestowed title of UNESCO, bearer of World Intangible Cultural Heritage. The nomination cited the first complete global restoration of the lost Mingqing Guimen Dan performance system, making an outstanding contribution to the protection of humanity's oral and intangible heritage. The core content of that nomination material, the so-called complete restoration of the Guimen Dan performing system, was lifted entirely from Wen's manuscript. Cheng had simply changed the cover from Crane Garden Performing System to Nanqing Performing System. Inside, not a single character was altered. The only change was to Wen's vermilion notes on core body rhythm parameters, the wrist curvature when releasing and retracting water sleeves, the stride dimensions, the focal points of the gaze. Changing applies solely to Guimen Dan applies to all female role types. Wen shut his eyes and felt it was truly over this time. An old Kunku artist pushed from a lighting bridge, fallen onto crash mats, clutching a loose-leaf notation book, dying quietly. In his lifetime, he had taught innumerable students, directed countless operas, won uncountable awards. He had started learning opera at 8, debuted on stage at 12, became the youngest Plum Blossom Award winner at 20, began compiling the Guimen Dan performing system at 30, purchased a Ming Dynasty house in a Suzhou water town and converted it into a transmission studio at 40, and was named a UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Bearer at 50. The role he performed most often was Lu Mengmei, the lovesick scholar in the Peony Pavilion. Countless times on stage he had sung to Du Linyang, "For you, a face like flower, a life like flowing water." He'd sung it for the greater part of his life and finally died in a rehearsal hall he had designed himself, lying among the discarded old costumes he had once retired. He didn't die. Around 6 in the morning, a janitor arriving to clean the rehearsal hall found him. The janitor's surname was Chiu, a man in his early 60s who had worked as a custodian at the Opera Academy for most of his life and had watched Wen Bumming transform from a young martial role actor into a white-haired Kunku master. His job was to arrive every morning at 5, wipe the mirrors, mop the floors, and dust the swords, spears, and halberds on the prop shelves. First he saw the dark pool of blood on the crash mats. In the dawn light it looked not red but black, like the dark curtain that falls after a tragedy has played out on stage. Then he saw the crumpled human shape on the mat, moon-white rehearsal clothes soaked through with blood and sweat, clinging to the body like a white magnolia blossom torn down by a storm. Old Chiu's mop clattered to the floor, its wooden handle bouncing twice before rolling under a prop rack. Without a word, he hoisted the man off the mat, wrapped him in his own padded cotton coat, and carried him on his back at a stumbling run to the nearest hospital. The coat, a navy blue twill winter uniform issued by the Academy, wrapped around Wen Bumming like an enormous bandage. As he ran through the pre-dawn campus, the trailing hem left a long smear of blood on the cement path, stamped into a string of blurry footprints by his cloth shoes. In the ER, he handed Wen to the doctors and said only, "This is Teacher Wen. Save him." The rescue took 16 hours, 6,000 milliliters of blood transfused, for surgeries. The first stabilized the spine, 6 titanium alloy screws and 2 titanium rods realigned the shattered vertebrae piece by piece. The second reduced the rib fractures, 3 titanium plates and over a dozen screws for 7 ribs. The third removed the spleen entirely. The internal bleeding couldn't be stopped any other way. The fourth cleaned the left ear canal. Most of the bone splinters were extracted, but the auditory ossicles were destroyed, the stapes, incus and malleus, the 3 smallest bones in the human body, crushed like a miniature set of chime bells pulverized by a hammer. 14 days post-op, when Bumming woke in the ICU. The world on his left side was absolute void, not silence, but vacuum. He could feel his left ear's physical presence, but it was like a microphone whose plug had been pulled, receiving no signal whatsoever. With his right ear he heard the beeping of the cardiac monitor, monotonous, rhythmic, devoid of any melodic variation, and to him it was the most beautiful sound on earth, because it proved he was still alive. He remembered something Mei Lanfang once said, "An actor's greatest luck is to die on stage." He hadn't died on stage. He died on a pile of crash mats and then come back to life. Using a nurse's phone, he dialed a number. That number belonged to a man named Yen Mubai, his upper bunk brother from the opera training school 40 years earlier. For 5 years they'd shared a bunk, stretched their legs together in the training hall, sitting face to face on mats with soles pressed together, pulling each other forward by the hands and gritting their teeth in pain, neither willing to let go first. They'd risen before dawn together to do voice exercises. Mornings at the school began with yi yi, triple A, their breath turning to frosty clouds in the winter air. Yen studied the Shaoxing, the young male role, Wen studied the Wuxing, the martial male role. At the school's showcase performance, they'd performed Meeting of the Heroes together, Yen as Zhou Yu, Wen as Zhao Yun. After that show, the old headmaster had called them into his office, patted their shoulders, and said, "You two, one has a scholarly spark, the other a martial backbone. The future of Kunke will rest on your generation's shoulders." Yen Mubai later left performing, saying that acting meant playing other people all his life, and he wanted to be himself. He pivoted into performance brokerage and theater management, starting from the most basic box office work and building an empire step by step. 40 years later, he controlled the world's largest performing arts agency and chain theater brand, with hundreds of professional venues in major cities across the globe. Yet his office displayed no plaques for commercial honors, only a single framed photograph, a faded old picture of 2 young men in the opera school training room, wearing sweat-soaked practice clothes, one frozen in a cloud hands preparatory gesture, the other in a mountain arms heroic pose, both laughing like martial apprentices who had just mastered a new move. On the back of the photo was a line Wen Bumming had written in brush calligraphy back then: "Skill never weighs down the body, opera never leaves the heart." When Yen Mubai answered the call, he was inside a theater in Tokyo's Ginza district, discussing next year's touring plan. The theater, called Snow, Moon, Flower, was one of his flagship venues in Asia, and they were negotiating an experimental cross-cultural production blending Japanese no with kunko. The theater manager was guiding him through the backstage area, Yen running his hand over imported Italian lighting equipment while calculating next year's schedule in his head. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, unknown number, a mainland China area code. He nearly hung up, but he recognized the code. It was from the city where the Kunka company was based. He answered, heard the frail voice on the other end, and the tour schedule slipped from his fingers and scattered across the backstage floor. He stood in silence behind the stage wing curtain for a long time, the velvet fabric trembling faintly under his fingertips. The theater manager, thinking Yen was dissatisfied with the backstage lighting, began to explain, but Yen waved him out. Then he spoke into the phone, voice pitched low but every word ripped from the deepest cavity of his chest. "I'm sending my private jet for you. From this moment on, there is no person in this world named Wen Bumming." Under an assumed name, Wen Bumming was transferred to a rehabilitation hospital in a Suzhou water town. The town was famous for kunku. Its streets were lined with transmission institutes and opera societies, and the air was threaded with the melismatic cadences and string and bamboo accompaniments of the water-grinding aria style. The rehab hospital sat at the deepest part of the town, inside a converted Ming Dynasty mansion whose courtyard held an abandoned antique stage. The stage was modest, 3 bays wide, its 2 vermilion pillars at the proscenium faded, their carved couplets still faintly legible. "The vast universe is a theater. Please watch the play within the play. Every look up and down mirrors the self. Do not push away the body beyond the body from its reflection." Wen's ward window faced this ancient stage directly. Every day, lying in bed, he listened with his one good ear to the silk and bamboo melodies and fragmented singing drifting through the window, a full year of kunku, as if on an endless loop. He remained there for nearly a year. The titanium screws in his spine announced their presence punctually with every damp day of the Jiang and plum rain season, a reminder that he was still alive. Each rainy spell brought a dull, sour swelling deep in the bone around the screws, as if something were slowly tightening inside the marrow. His rehab therapist was a retired whooshing performer from the provincial Kunko company, a Suzhou native named Shi whose technique was extraordinarily nuanced. He combined traditional Kunko body training with modern sports rehabilitation, making one practice water sleeve movements lying in bed, tracing circles in the air with his fingers, the circles needing to be round, even, with a sense of release and retraction. Shi said, "Operatic body movement isn't made by the arms, it's made by the dantian, the body's energetic core. Your spine is broken, but your dantian energy remains. As long as the dantian isn't scattered, you can stand again." When said, "I know. I've stood for most of my life," Shi replied, "Then keep standing." Once he could get out of bed, a long regimen of further rehab followed. The town's bluestone-paved lanes became his training field. Every day he walked the riverbank leaning on a bamboo cane, from the hospital to the central ancient stage and back. At first, he could only manage a few hundred meters. With each step, his right knee emitted a faint friction sound, like a gramophone needle skating slightly on a record. Gradually, he made it a kilometer, then 3. The townspeople grew accustomed to this white-haired stranger with a slight drag in his right leg, accustomed to his punctual appearance on the riverside flagstone path every morning. Sometimes he would pause and stand by the river, listening to the singing drifting from the opera society on the opposite bank. Some sang well, some poorly. He never commented. He just listened. 3 years later, in a lane along the canal in the town's deepest quarter, he opened a tiny opera headdress repair shop. He called it Bayan Headdress Repair, and he renamed himself Chiu Bayan. Chiu was the surname of old Chiu, the janitor who had saved his life. Bayan meant no words, a vow to speak less and do more. In his lifetime, the most words he had ever spoken were not at academic conferences, but in rehearsal halls, explaining to young performers how to express joy and sorrow with water sleeves, how to convey tragedy and parting with the eyes, how to stride 1,000 miles across a mere square of stage. Every single one of those words had been useful, not a syllable wasted. Now he husbanded his words and let headdress repair speak in their place. The shop was so small it held only one man, one workbench, and one set of shelves. The walls were covered in headdress repair tools, from the finest tweezers to sandpaper of every grit, from the deer antler glue used in traditional kingfisher feather inlay to natural dyes he mixed himself. On the workbench, under an adjustable LED lamp, always sat a bowl of clear water and an old phoenix crown mid-repair. A hand-painted wooden sign hung outside, the lettering as precise as if measured with a ruler, all reparable headdresses fixed. Kingfisher inlay repair 50, silver gilt refinishing 100, antique kingfisher restoration negotiable. No plastic headdresses. The last 4 characters he had carved with particular force. Plastic headdresses were industrial assembly line products. They had no soul. He repaired headdresses that possessed soul. The townsfolk called him Mutio. He barely spoke 5 sentences a day. He opened the shop at 6 in the morning and closed at 8 at night. His repair technique was singular. When doing kingfisher inlay, he used no modern adhesives, only a deer antler glue he prepared himself. The glue was rendered from Sika deer antlers. The art lay in controlling the heating temperature. Too high and the glue turned brittle, too low and it wouldn't bond. He could tune the glue's viscosity so precisely that it allowed point adhesion on individual feathers, each glue dot no larger than a fraction of a millimeter. Repairing a Ming Dynasty kingfisher feather phoenix crown took him 5 to 7 days, entirely by hand, without a single modern tool. When he finished, every kingfisher feather on the crown matched the original in placement angle exactly. He could judge the deviation of a feather's angle from the original with the naked eye, without any magnification. His right eye, trained over decades of stage performance and teaching, had developed a microscopic sensitivity. He could discern the alignment of every barb on a kingfisher feather just as he had once been able to spot, from the stage, whether the person in the third row, center seat was truly watching the opera. One day an old professor from a nearby drama academy passed by, carrying a Qing dynasty kingfisher phoenix crown with a broken beak to be repaired. It was a family heirloom, the dowry of his great-grandmother, who had been the most renowned Guimen Dan in late Qing Suzhou and had worn this crown while performing the Peony Pavilion. The beak had been smashed off during a political campaign decades earlier by Red Guards, and the fractured edge had oxidized black. The professor had approached several repair masters, all of whom said it was unfixable. The kingfisher craft was lost. The curve of the beak was too complex. The feathers at the break were missing and needed re-dyeing and trimming. Xiao Bian took the crown, turned it over once in his hands, examined the break with his right eye, and said, "This isn't mid-Qing craftsmanship. It's a late Qing imitation." Mid-Qing used natural indigo to dye kingfisher feathers. Late Qing used Prussian blue. Natural indigo oxidation fades toward gray. Prussian blue oxidation fades toward green. See the root of the feathers at the break, the color leans green. That means it's a Guangxu-era copy. But the copying skill is exceptionally high. It might have been done by a master from the Suzhou Imperial Textile Workshop. The old professor was stunned. He had spent most of his life researching opera artifacts and knew full well the difference between mid-Qing and late-Qing kingfisher techniques. Natural indigo was a plant dye extracted from woad root. Prussian blue was a synthetic pigment from German chemical factories, and their spectral signatures were entirely different. But he had never heard such professional artifact analysis come from a headdress repairman's mouth. Xiao Bian redyed a batch of kingfisher feathers with his own indigo brew, made from fermented woad root, lime, and rice wine. The fermentation time controlled down to the day, then used deer antler glue to reattach the feathers one by one, precisely matching the original alignment. With a self-sharpened miniature pair of scissors, he trimmed each feather to an exact replica of the original shape, down to the curve of the tip, the serration of the edge, even the microscopic surface texture. Finally, he applied a self-formulated antiquing oxidation solution to the repair area, ensuring the color of new and old feathers would visually unify after oxidation. The whole restoration took nearly 10 days. The professor took the repaired crown and examined it under a magnifying glass for a long time. As an authority on opera artifact authentication, he had spent the better part of half a century studying the authenticity of headdresses with that lens. He checked the feather arrangement, the dye effect, and the adhesive traces inch by inch for almost half an hour, then put down the magnifying glass, removed his reading glasses, and wiped them. "I've been in this field nearly 50 years, he said. "The finest kingfisher craftsman I've ever seen was an old Miao woman in Leishan, Guizhou. She could differentiate 7 shades of blue on a single feather. But your craftsmanship is different from hers. Her excellence is natural genius. Yours is precision. The feathers you relayed in the repair, each one's angle is completely identical to the original. This degree of precision doesn't feel like a repairman's precision. Headdress repairmen rely on experience. You're relying on something else. You weren't always a repairman." Xiao Bian didn't answer. He wrapped the restored crown in Suzhou embroidered silk, placed it in an old brocade box, and handed it over. The professor took the box and said, "You weren't always a headdress repairman." Xiao Bian said nothing. The professor didn't ask further, just placed the box into his cloth bag, leaned on his cane, and left. At the mouth of the lane he paused, looked back at the wooden sign outside Bian Headdress Repair, and said, as if to himself, "Repairing headdresses is a form of spiritual cultivation. Repairing the heart is also cultivation." Xiao Bian never engaged. No one knew his past. Nor did anyone notice that in the gaps between repairs, the hours waiting for deer antler glue to cure, the hours waiting for indigo dye to oxidize, the moments when silver gilt pieces were bouncing in the ultrasonic cleaner. He was filling ledgers with an extraordinarily precise symbolic system, recording a complete set of Guimen Dan performance systems for Kunku. The symbols resembled movement diagrams but were more abstract, akin to gongche notation yet more conceptual. He had invented a shorthand of geometric shapes and numbers to encode body movement parameters, a circle for cloud hands, a circle with a dot for sleeve flip, a wavy line for the arc of a water sleeve with numbers above indicating the exact wrist angle degrees. In 3 years, he filled dozens of ledgers, each wrapped in moisture-proof oil paper and locked in a fireproof safe in the shop's attic. The safe's combination was the gongche notation of the first line from the Peony Pavilions. A dream interrupted, those pitch symbols converted into numbers, the cipher of his life. An old radio in the shop was his sole window to the outside world. He'd picked it up at the town's flea market, a vintage red lantern tube radio shell into which he'd swapped a new amplifier circuit and speaker. He had tuned the frequency response to a dead-flat vocal mode, free of coloration, so the broadcast opera voices came through as cleanly as live unamplified singing in a rehearsal room. Every afternoon while repairing headdresses, he kept it on an opera channel. That afternoon, the Kumku Appreciation Program was interrupted by a news bulletin. The announcer's voice held a restrained pride. Qing Nianqing had held a press conference at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, announcing that her book, The Aesthetics of Guimen Dan Performance, had been translated into over a dozen languages and released globally. This was the first time a Chinese opera performing artist had individually published a high-end opera aesthetics monograph worldwide. Then the radio carried Qing Nianqing's own voice. Xiao Bian knew that voice too well, the slender girl who 17 years ago had transferred from Suzhou Pingtan's storytelling school into the Opera Academy's affiliated high school. So nervous for her first stage appearance that she tangled her water sleeves and couldn't shake them free for a long while. Now she was on a UNESCO podium, speaking with a cadence both graceful and confident. Her voice was still beautiful, carrying the soft, melismatic tail of the water-grinding aria style, every final syllable rising with a perfectly judged upward flick, like a water sleeve tracing an immaculate arc through the air. The first time when Bumming heard her open her mouth to sing the Peony Pavilion, he had said, "That voice is a gift from heaven. But heaven only gives half, the other half you have to train yourself." Qing Nianqing said, "Everything I have achieved originates from my mentor, Mr. Wen Bumming. Teacher Wen died in the line of duty several years ago in a rehearsal hall fire. His artistic spirit has always been the lighthouse guiding my path." Her voice paused, taking on a controlled quaver. "I still remember the last time I saw Teacher Wen. It was on the lighting bridge in the rehearsal hall. He was up there adjusting the lights, and I was below rehearsing the movements for A Dream Interrupted from the Peony Pavilion. He leaned out from the bridge and said to me, 'Nianqing, your water sleeves are still missing one breath. That breath isn't thrown with your arms, it's thrown with your heart.' I've carried those words in my heart ever since. Today, I want to say to Teacher Wen, Teacher, that breath of yours, I have continued it for you." A reporter asked whether Wen Bumming had left any unfinished performance manuscripts. Qing Nianqing's voice dipped slightly, layered with carefully controlled restraint and regret. In his later years, Teacher Wen suffered from severe ear disease and was basically deaf in his left ear. For an opera performer, being unable to hear the accompaniment is a devastating blow. He appeared on stage less and less, spending most of his time on desk work, but he left almost no complete performance notes. Many precious movement designs and aria treatments departed with him. That is a regret for all of us who come after. Another reporter asked, "There are voices questioning whether some core parameters of water sleeve technique in your book, particularly the method of controlling wrist curvature, are highly similar to content Teacher Wen Bumming presented in closed-door lectures. How do you respond?" Qing's tone remained mellow, but her tempo picked up slightly. Kumku water sleeve technique is a publicly shared cultural heritage passed down for centuries. It is not any single person's original creation. The water sleeve technique summary in my book is the fruit of what I have learned from multiple teachers since I began studying opera at 13, combined with my own accumulated stage experience. Teacher Wen was my first mentor. I learned a great deal from him. But my book is a systematic overview of the entire Kumku Guimen Dan performing tradition, not a record of any one teacher's personal insights. If those raising doubts can produce scholarly evidence, I am willing to engage in open academic discussion on any platform. Xiao Bian was restoring a crushed Republican-era kingfisher ornamental hairpin flower. An old aficionado from Shanghai had sent it. It had belonged to his mother, worn during private performances in her youth. The petals had been flattened, the silver filigree stamens broken in several places. When the radio delivered Cheng Yanqing's words, basically deaf in his left ear, the tweezers in his hand paused for a fraction of a heartbeat on the surface of a kingfisher feather. He wrote a string of symbols in his ledger, then stood and stretched his stiff spine. The jiang and plum rain season had just ended, the humidity still high, and the titanium screws in his vertebrae always ached dully in this weather. From deep in a drawer, he pulled out an old cell phone and dialed a number. A young woman's voice answered, carrying the lilt of the Wu dialect. "Uncle Chiu, I've traced all of Cheng Yanqing's overseas royalty income. She sold the international rights to the aesthetics of Guimen Dan performance to multiple countries, with a total contract value over several million euros. That doesn't even include the later documentary adaptation rights and streaming platform exclusivity fees." I did a cross-comparison. The textual descriptions of the 36 water sleeve movements for Guimen Dan in her book are highly consistent with the manuscript content teacher when bumming presented in closed lectures. Especially that core technique, the wrist curvature control during water sleeve retraction and release. Those curvature parameters can't be found in any published opera teaching material. When bumming created them. He once gave an internal lecture at the Kunke Company on the biomechanical analysis of water sleeve technique, judging wrist angle precision by the frequency of the wind sound a sleeve makes slicing through the air. I found the audio recording of that lecture. The young woman was called Qiu Xiuwan, the granddaughter of old Qiu, the janitor who had saved one. She had grown up in the Opera Academy's rehearsal halls, knew the lighting angles and floor elasticity of every room. She had studied kunku but hadn't become a professional performer. Instead, she pursued opera theory at the Shanghai Theatre Academy. She possessed an almost feral sensitivity to archival material, the ability to locate the single most critical piece of evidence amid mountains of dusty files and recordings. She was Qiu Baiyan's sole ally in this water town. A headdress repairman and an opera theory graduate student, an oddly effective duo. Every time Qiu Xiaowan visited the shop, she brought a laptop and a freshly printed stack of document comparison materials, sitting on the little bamboo stool in the corner, reporting the latest developments while watching Qiu repair headdresses. His repair rhythm never sped up or slowed down because of her reports. The tweezers always gripped the kingfisher feathers with uniform force. The deer antler glue always spread to a consistent thickness. But Qiu Xiuwan noticed that whenever she reported a key data point, the angle of Qiu Baiyan's right ear would tilt ever so slightly toward her. Qiu Baiyan was silent for a moment. He placed the restored kingfisher hairpin flower on a chamois leather pad and lightly dusted it with a soft brush. The silver stamens he had reattached with deer antler glue trembled faintly under the lamp, like real stamens quivering in a breeze. That wrist curvature control parameter took me decades to work out. Not with a protractor, with my ears. The sound a water sleeve makes cutting through the air. Different wrist angles produce different frequency wind sounds. Too straight an angle, the sound is too sharp, like a blade slicing air. That's the force of a diomedon, a female warrior roll. Too rounded an angle, the sound is too muffled, like a body wrapped in a quilt. That's the weight of a laudan, an old woman roll. The perfect curvature produces a mid-frequency, rounded, unpiercing sound. That's the specific restrained elegance of the Guimen Dan. Once you've heard that sound, you never forget it. It's less like wind and more like someone sighing softly right beside your ear. When Cheng Yanqing copied my data, she didn't change a single character. But she changed the applicable role type I had written applies solely to Guimen Dan, and she changed it to applies to all female role types. Because she never understood why that curvature only fits the Guimen Dan. A Guimen Dan is a sheltered young lady, a Du Linyang who has to hide even her springtime languor from her parents. Her water sleeve retractions must be restrained and inward, the wrist curvature small, soft, contained. A diomedon is a female general, a Mugaying who makes life and death decisions on the battlefield. Her water sleeves need force, the curvature large, the release crisp. If you apply the Guimen Dan's restrained curvature to a Diomedon's heroic strength, the sleeves come out limp, like a spear with a broken head. You copied my data, but you didn't copy the wind sounds I heard. You weren't there in the rehearsal hall, at countless dawns, throwing your water sleeves over and over, listening to the wind until your ears grew calloused, listening until your left ear couldn't hear anymore, and still listening with your right. Xiao Xiaowan was quiet for a few seconds. The night breeze of the Jiang and water town bled through the phone's receiver, mingling with the distant creak of black-canopied punting boats on the canal and her own suppressed breathing. She was silent a beat, then asked, "Uncle Chiu, who are you really?" Xiao Bian didn't answer. He placed the repaired hairpin flower into an old brocade box and closed the lid. Pasted on the lid was a yellowed fragment of a vintage amateur performance program. "Notify your Grandpa Yan. Initiate the short. He's been waiting for this day a very long time. Also, anonymously send the cross-comparison report between the aesthetics of Guimen Dan performance and Wen Buming's original manuscripts to the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee, the International Theatre Institute, and the Editorial Board of Theatre Review. Do it to the standard of academic fraud detection, line-by-line comparison, parameter-by-parameter comparison. Every piece of plagiarized content must cite the original source, date of creation, and verification record." Didn't Cheng Yanqing say she's willing to engage in open academic discussion on any platform? Then, let's give her a platform the whole world can see. 1 week later. UNESCO headquarters, Paris, France. UNESCO headquarters sits on Place de Fontenoy in the 7th arrondissement, a modernist Y-shaped building. The main conference hall, the organization's highest-profile venue, is typically used for the World Heritage Committee sessions and Intangible Cultural Heritage Protection meetings. Cheng Yanqing had booked the largest hall for the global launch of the aesthetics of Guimen Dan performance and the opening of the Beauty of Eastern Opera global touring exhibition. She wore a custom Suzhou embroidered qipao depicting the scene A Walk in the Garden, a dream interrupted from the Peony Pavilion. Before the Peony Pavilion, Lu Mengmei holding a willow branch, Du Linyang leaning on the balustrade. The qipao's hem swayed with her steps, its silk threads glowing softly under the lights. She wore a Cheng family kingfisher feather phoenix crown, a modern piece in the Ming style handmade by the finest Suzhou kingfisher artisan, every feather dyed with natural indigo. She stood before a massive LED screen that cycled through a documentary of her artistic life. The little girl with 2 braids at the Suzhou Pingdan School, the teenager sweating in the training room of the Opera Academy's affiliated high school. The young artist clutching her Plum Blossom Award trophy with tear-filled eyes, and finally the poised, elegant world-class intangible cultural heritage bearer on the UNESCO podium. In fluent English, French, and Mandarin, she narrated her legendary journey from an ordinary family in a Suzhou water town to world-renowned bearer of heritage. She spoke of her mentor Wen Buming, the old gentleman who, during the affiliated high school's entrance audition, after all the candidates had performed and the judges were preparing to wrap up, suddenly stood up and said, "Wait, let me see her one more time." He made Cheng Yanqing, who was already packing up to leave, step back onto the stage and asked her a single question: "Why do you want to study Kunku?" She answered, "Because my grandmother loves to listen to it." When Bumming was silent for a moment, then sat back down and said, "You stay." Only later did she learn that Wen's own grandmother had also sung Kunku and had been a locally famous Guimen Dan in Suzhou during the Republic era. In his entire life, he had asked that why only once and taken a student on an exception only once. As emotion swelled, her voice trembled. When Teacher Wen left us in the rehearsal hall several years ago, I stood for a very long time in that rehearsal hall where he had spent most of his life. I stood at center stage, facing the mirror he had used all those years to check his posture, his expression, every minute shift of his gaze, that mirror already coated with a thin film of dust. I stood before it, looking at my own reflection, and suddenly felt the person in the mirror wasn't me, it was him. His eyes, his posture, his obsession with Kunku, loving it with his very life, it had grown into my bones. I said to that dust-coated mirror, "Teacher, I will make sure the world hears the voice of the East. I will make sure Kunku's water-grinding melody sings from this tiny rehearsal hall all the way to the entire world. The applause was thunderous. In the center seat of the front row sat a young man in a navy blue custom Zhongshan suit, a jadeite brooch pinned to his chest. He was Cheng Nianqing's husband and the chief operating officer of Nianqing Culture, Shin Moyan. Cheng's eyes met his across the room, and the corner of his mouth lifted in an arc only the two of them could read. In his hands, he held a bouquet of peonies made of Suzhou embroidered silk, custom created for this launch, their petals stitched thread by thread, their stamens crafted from old kingfisher feathers taken from a vintage phoenix crown in the Kunshan Kunku Museum. Just as Cheng Nianqing was about to press the remote to play the Beauty of Eastern Opera global tour promotional video, every light in the conference hall went out simultaneously. Not a circuit breaker trip, the sightseeing boats on the Seine outside still glittered. Only this hall. Emergency lights did not activate. Every electronic screen went black. Phones went dark. Someone screamed in the dark. Someone tried to turn on a phone flashlight and couldn't. The blackout lasted about 20 seconds. The UNESCO main hall has a long reverberation time. In those 20 seconds of absolute darkness, everyone could hear their own breath echoing through the chamber. Then, through the windows, the giant LED facade of the Eiffel Tower across the Seine lit up. The Eiffel Tower, Paris's landmark, is clad with more than 20,000 LED lights that usually perform light shows on the hour. Tonight, the lights didn't flash. The entire facade became pure white. On that whiteness emerged a line of text in black, in both French and Chinese, except the font was standard regular script from opera gongche notation manuals, cold, as if traced directly from the title page of some century-old score. Cheng Nianqing, do you still remember the gongche notation book whose pages you tore out? Cheng Nianqing froze at the podium. The remote slipped from her fingers, bounced on the solid wood lectern and rolled behind the projection equipment. The tower's facade continued. Several years ago, on the lighting bridge of the Opera Academy's rehearsal hall, you tampered with my movement data, tore pages from my notation book, and pushed me off the bridge. You thought I was dead. I'm not. Today, I've come to reclaim what you stole from me. Not revenge, restoration, returning the new to match the old. You sold a plagiarized and falsified performance aesthetic to the world for years. Every young actor misguided by your erroneous techniques, every good production wrecked by your wrong staging, every audience member deceived by your lies, all of it is on your head. The hall exploded. Theater journalists from across the globe rushed to the windows, phones raised to take photos, but their phones were still dead. Some tried laptops, but the signal was jammed. Only the text on the Eiffel Tower facade burned coldly through the winter night in Paris, each letter the height of a full story. Tourists on the Champ de Mars stopped to stare upward. Some began shooting with cameras. Cameras were not jammed, and flashbulbs popped across the esplanade. Cheng Nianqing spun toward backstage and shouted, "Shut down the tower lights. This is defamation. Call the police." Her voice fed through her headset to the control booth, but no one responded. Inside the booth, the technical team arranged in advance by Yan Mubai had already taken over the Eiffel Tower's LED control system, not a hack, a fully legal takeover. Yan Mubai's group had secured temporary usage rights for the tower's facade weeks earlier under the auspices of sponsoring Paris's Cultural Olympiad. He'd spent most of his life in the international performance market and never walked into a fight unprepared. His legal team had scrutinized every clause of the authorization agreement, making it watertight under EU law. The tower facade began displaying the first piece of evidence, scanned pages of Wenbuming's original performance system manuscripts, yellowed mulberry paper, alternately inscribed with regular script and vermilion notes, each page bearing Wen's signature and date in the bottom right corner. The earliest pages were dated many years back, recording his first attempts at the Suzhou Kunku Transmission Institute to use biomechanics to systematically analyze the relationship between a Guimendan's water sleeve wrist curvature and the frequency of the wind sound produced. The notes were exquisitely detailed: different wrist angles, different sleeve lengths, different fabric materials, different air humidity conditions, and the resulting frequency shifts of the sound the sleeve made slicing through air. Beside each dataset, gongche notation marked the corresponding movement name and opera source. Then the second piece of evidence, a line-by-line comparison of Cheng Nianqing's The Aesthetics of Guimen Dan performance with Wen Buming's original manuscripts. Qiu Xiaowan had done this work. The analysis was formatted as an academic paper, every plagiarized passage flagged with its original source, date of creation, and verification record. The core parameters, water sleeve wrist curvature control, were completely identical between the two documents. However, Cheng's version had stripped out all the restrictive roll-type markers indicating applies solely to Guimen Dan. That alteration meant water sleeve techniques for different roll types were collapsed and conflated in her system. Then the third piece of evidence, an audio clip. Cheng Nianqing's own voice. The recording was made in a very private setting. In the background you could hear the faint creak of the rehearsal hall's wooden floor and the distant kunku music drifting from the academy's campus PA. Cheng was on the phone, her tone brimming with repressed excitement and nerves. I've already got all of Teacher Wen's movement scores. All his original manuscripts are locked in the iron cabinet in the rehearsal hall. The key is in the third drawer of his desk drawer organizer. I took advantage of the afternoon he went into the city for a meeting and photographed every single one of those several hundred pages with my phone. The 36 water sleeve techniques, the 72 body movement keys, the 18 eye expression methods, they're all with me. Help me contact a publisher. I want to put out a book using this material. Yes, fast. Before anyone knows these manuscripts even exist. The person on the other end seemed to ask a question. Cheng's voice dropped even lower. Teacher Wen's left ear hearing has been deteriorating for years. When he's up on the lighting bridge adjusting the lights, he can't even hear me shouting from below. An old artist nearly deaf, who can't even catch the beat of the accompaniment. What stage can he still step on? What opera can he still direct? He can last maybe another year or two at most. Once he retires, these manuscripts are mine alone. Then the final piece of evidence, a high-definition security video. The full footage of Wen Buming's fall in the Opera Academy rehearsal hall several years earlier. The camera was mounted in the corner of the ceiling to monitor the stage lighting equipment. The picture was color, high resolution. The footage showed Wen Buming on the lighting bridge, holding the gongche notation book, arguing heatedly with Cheng Nianqing, who stood below. His expression was anger and disbelief. He had just discovered someone had tampered with the manuscripts locked in his iron cabinet. Several pages had been torn out, the edges raw and white, including the core parameter tables of the 36 water sleeve techniques. Cheng stood beneath him, looking up, water sleeves still on her hands. They argued fiercely for several minutes. Then Wen turned to check the lighting control panel at the far end of the bridge. He wanted to adjust the follow spot angle for that evening's rehearsal. The moment he turned, Cheng climbed the maintenance ladder up to the bridge, rushed at him from behind, and shoved him violently. Wen crashed through the bridge railing, flipped over, and plummeted toward the rehearsal hall floor. An old man with white hair rose abruptly from the audience. He wore a dark gray French wool overcoat, the ribbon of the Legion of Honor peeking from his pocket. He was the lifelong honorary advisor to UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee and the towering elder of global opera aesthetics, the 90-year-old Monsieur Jean-Pierre Dupont. In his youth, he had studied comparative literature at the Sorbonne, and by chance watched a documentary about Mélenchon in a small cinema in the Latin Quarter. He fell in love with Eastern opera, sold his vineyard in Provence, flew alone to Beijing, audited courses at the Opera Academy for years, then lived in Suzhou for a long time, learning the Suzhou dialect and how to sing the Peony Pavilion from an old master at a Konku Transmission Institute. He had devoted his life to studying Eastern opera. He had come today purely as a courtesy. At his age, with mobility problems, he rarely attended public events. Cheng Nianqing had personally flown to Paris and called on him multiple times to persuade him to come. Monsieur Dupont stared at the movement comparison analysis on the tower facade for a long time. His eyes were failing. He needed a high-power magnifier to make out the details of the gongche notation. But his understanding of kunka body movement remained crystalline, the only legacy left by a lifetime of immersion in Eastern opera. When he had finished, he folded his magnifier and put it in his pocket. Then he turned toward Cheng Nianqing, who had collapsed on the stage, and spoke. His voice was aged but full of strength, and in the perfect acoustics of the UNESCO conference hall, every word rang out with utter clarity. Madam Cheng, the core parameter in your book for controlling the wrist curvature of Guimen Dan water sleeves. The method of judging the sleeve angle by wind sound frequency. I saw Mr. Wen Bumming demonstrate this with my own eyes in a rehearsal hall when I visited Suzhou over a decade ago. He played me a recording, a spectrogram of wind sounds produced when his water sleeves swept through the air at different angles. He had turned wind into visible curves, each curve corresponding to a specific sleeve angle. I told him then it was the most scientific method for opera body movement research I had ever seen. He smiled and shook his head and said it wasn't science, it was experience. Experience he had spent half his life accumulating, throwing water sleeves hundreds of thousands of times, listening until his left ear went deaf. Your book contains no citation for this, none whatsoever. You didn't even list his name in your references. Monsieur Dupont paused, returned his magnifier to his coat pocket, then looked into Cheng Nianqing's eyes and spoke a single sentence, one word at a time. This sentence would later be quoted simultaneously by the arts pages of Le Figaro and the New York Times. Dans le monde de l'opéra, il y a deux sortes d'artistes, ceux qui créent la beauté, et ceux qui la volent. Madame Cheng, votre livre est magnifiquement écrit. Mais la beauté n'y ment pas. Et la beauté que vous décrivez n'est pas la vôtre. In the world of opera, there are only two kinds of artists, those who create beauty and those who steal it. Madam Cheng, your book is beautifully written. But beauty does not lie. And the beauty you describe is not yours. Total silence filled the hall. Cheng Nianqing collapsed completely onto the stage, the hem of her Suzhou embroidered qipao soaking in a spilled bottle of mineral water. Her phoenix crown tilted askew, its kingfisher feathers trembling under the lights. She tried to say something, but her throat produced only a gurgling sound, like a trapped thrush. Her right hand began to shake violently. It was carpal tunnel syndrome from years of throwing water sleeves and gripping pens to sign documents, now compounded by a functional tremor under overwhelming psychological shock. She clamped her left hand over her right, but it kept trembling, her entire right arm convulsed. The hand of an opera performer, the hand that had once traced countless perfect water sleeve arcs on stage with breathtaking precision, now spasmed uselessly on the podium at UNESCO headquarters. Shen Moyan sat in the front row. He wore a navy custom Zhongshan suit, carefully chosen that morning. He was supposed to go on stage and present flowers to his wife, so he had picked the color that best complemented her embroidered qipao. The bouquet of silk peonies now lay on his lap, their petals trembling. Not because the petals trembled, but because his hands did. He wasn't looking at the movement comparisons on the tower facade, nor at his wife collapsed on the stage, nor at anyone. He stared at the stamen of the bouquet, the stamens made from old kingfisher feathers taken from a vintage kunku phoenix crown, and suddenly recalled that morning, before they left the hotel, when Cheng Nianqing had stood before the full-length mirror adjusting her headdress and had turned back to smile at him. She had said, after tonight's press conference, she would take him on a boat ride on the Seine. In all their years of marriage, she had never once taken him on a boat ride. She was always too busy, always had operas to rehearse, press conferences to hold, endless international flights. He had always believed she was busy with her beloved art. Now he understood. It wasn't art she was busy with. It was the cover-up. The main doors of the conference hall swung open. Not kicked or thrown wide, but pushed steadily by one hand, gentle pressure, the way one opens the soundproof door of a rehearsal room. A middle-aged man entered. He wore a faded, deep gray Changshan robe. Printed on the left chest pocket were the words, "Bayan headdress repair." His frame was gaunt, his hair cut very short, his temples completely white, so white they reflected the crystal chandeliers of the UNESCO hall. Over his shoulder hung an old canvas tool bag. In his right hand he carried an antique camphorwood opera trunk, the kind performers used to carry costumes and makeup. Its shell still plastered with faded airline baggage tags and customs stamps from international airports. He walked down the central red-carpeted aisle. The seats on either side held the most elite figures in global theater: the director of the Comédie Française, the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, the hereditary head of a no-theater school. As the white-haired man passed these seats, his silhouette layered over the century-old theatrical glory embedded in those chairs. His right leg dragged slightly, the hem of his changshan whispering across the red carpet. No one stopped him. Every gaze clung to him. The artist who had incarnated countless classic roles on stage forgot to speak, simply watching this white-haired man who had walked in from the Paris night move steadily toward the podium. Cheng Nianqing hauled herself up from the stage, saw his face, and collapsed again as if every bone had been yanked from her body. That face, she had thought about it nearly every day for years. Not with nostalgia. With terror. That face surfaced in the instinctive pause every time she faced a mirror to put on her makeup before a performance, in every nightmare that jolted her awake in the middle of the night, in the inexplicable anxiety that seized her whenever she threw her water sleeves. She always felt her wrist curvature wasn't perfect, that she couldn't achieve what her teacher had called the most beautiful wind sound. She had blamed her own insufficient skill. Now she knew it wasn't a skill problem. It was a conscience problem. A stolen curvature can never produce a truly perfect water sleeve wind sound. Because that mid-frequency, rounded sound, like a soft sigh right beside your ear, only someone whose heart is utterly unburdened can throw it. When bumming, Qiu Bian stopped in front of the podium. He didn't look at the woman crumpled on the floor. First, he bent and retrieved the remote control from behind the projection equipment, placing it on the lectern as naturally as picking up a fallen hairpin in a rehearsal room. Then he opened the old camphorwood trunk. Inside lay three things in precise order. First, an old gongche notation book, its binding burst and then resewn with silk thread, the cover bearing a handwritten label, Crane Garden Guimen Dan Complete Performance System, when bumming. The mulberry paper pages were stained along the edges with an oxidized rust color, blood, from when he had clutched this score during the fall. Second, the several hundred pages of Wen's original handwritten movement design notes, every page appended with detailed annotations he had made over the years for different operas, different characters, different dramatic contexts. Third, a copy of Cheng Nianqing's published The Aesthetics of Guimen Dan Performance. He opened both books to the page on the 36 water sleeve techniques and pointed with an old folding fan at the wrist curvature control column in the core parameter table. The fan was a prop commonly used by Kunkuyang male roles. Its leaf was painted with a sketch of orchids and rocks in the Xie style, inscribed with solitary orchid in an empty valley, the very fan he had used as a young man playing Lu Mingmei. The bamboo ribs had been burnished to a warm luster by decades of handling, the speckles of the Xiangfei bamboo mellowed like jade. I spent decades on this curvature parameter, he said. I traced the air in that rehearsal hall with water sleeves I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of times, memorizing the frequency shifts of air flowing across sleeve fabric every time I adjusted my wrist angle by a fraction of a degree. I listened until my left ear could hear nothing more, and I still listened with my right. You copied my data without changing a single character. But you applied it wrong. You used the restrained curvature of a Guimen Dan for the water sleeve work of a Diomedon. A Diomedon is a female general. Her water sleeves require force, a large curvature, a crisp release. When you apply Guimen Dan restraint to a Diomedon's heroic strength, the sleeves come out soft. Do you know what soft Diomedon water sleeves look like on stage? Like a spear with a broken head. The audience can't pinpoint what's wrong, but they'll feel this Mu Guiying isn't fierce enough, this Liang Hongyu isn't steely enough. You copied my data, but you didn't copy every role type I ever taught. You don't know that between a Guimen Dan and a Diomedon lies the entire person. From his tool bag, he withdrew one final object, a vintage kingfisher feather ornamental hairpin flower. The feathers gleamed a deep, shadowed blue under the lights, like a mountain spring hidden beneath a canopy of trees. He had commissioned this piece decades ago from an old Suzhou silversmith, using dozens of feathers from a single kingfisher. He had found the bird beside Lake Tai already dead, but its plumage intact. He had plucked the feathers one by one and arranged them following their natural growth direction into the shape of petals. Every petal's curve and angle was unique. Do you remember the first time you applied a hairpin flower, so nervous you couldn't even hold the tweezers steady? That was your first semester at the affiliated high school. I told you to practice putting on decorative forehead flowers in front of the mirror. Your hands shook so much the hairpin dropped, and several kingfisher feathers snapped. You looked up at me and said, "Teacher, I'm sorry, I'm so stupid." I told you, trembling hands don't matter. When your heart is inside the character in that mirror, your hands will stop trembling. Your hands are trembling now not because of carpal tunnel. It's because your heart is hollow. When the heart is hollow, the hands can never be steady. A hollow-hearted performer, on stage, doesn't dare meet the audience's eyes, throws water sleeves, but doesn't dare pull them back, strides out but doesn't dare stop. Do you know what hollow-hearted performance looks like on stage? Like a lamp whose oil has run out, the light dims, and finally, with a puff, it goes out. He placed the hairpin flower on the podium alongside the three other items, the gongche notation book, the movement notes, Cheng Nianqing's monograph. For objects lined up in a row, like 4 acts of an opera written side by side in the same notation book. The real on the left, the fake on the right. A lifetime on the left, an instant on the right. He turned and walked back toward the door. Crossing the red carpet in the center of the hall, he paused for a single beat beside one particular seat. On its backrest was a gold nameplate, Reserve au Maître when bumming. Many years ago, as China's Kunka delegate to a UNESCO World Intangible Heritage Conference, he had once sat in this very seat. After that conference's closing performance, UNESCO's Director General for Culture had clasped his hand and said, "Maître one. Votre système de notation du Kunko est le plus précis que j'ai jamais vu il mérite d'être inscrit au patrimoine mondial." Master 1, your Kumku movement notation system is the most precise I have ever seen. It deserves to be inscribed as World Heritage. That Director General had retired years ago, when Bumming stood before the empty seat in silence for a moment. Then he kept walking. At the doorway he stopped, not turning around. His gaze passed through the hundreds of shocked, tear-streaked, stunned faces in the hall, through the evidence still scrolling across the Eiffel Tower facade, through the crisp winter night of the Seine, and landed somewhere in the far distance, in a direction only he knew. Yan Ning. Xiaoming is taking her college entrance exams soon. Her first-choice major is Kunka performance at the Theatre Academy. On her application form she wrote a passage, "My mother was a Kunku performer. She left us when I was very young. I only remember the way her water sleeves looked on stage, like a white butterfly. I want to study Kunko not to become famous, but so that one day I can throw water sleeves exactly like my mother did and let my father see it from the audience." She wrote an essay that won a national first prize. The title was My Mother's Water Sleeves. She wrote, "When my mother's water sleeves sweep through the air, they make a very, very soft wind sound." Dad says that's the water sleeves speaking. Water sleeves can't speak, but he can understand them. I want to learn Kunku, to learn to throw water sleeves with the exact same wind sound as my mother, so Dad can hear it just once. His voice paused. The evening wind from the Seine pushed through the conference hall doorway, carrying the dampness of a Paris winter and the scent of butter from a nearby boulangerie, ruffling the open books and notation manuscripts on the podium. The mulberry paper pages stirred, coming to rest on a page filled with sketched water-sleeve trajectories, countless graceful curves flowing from release to retraction, every curve annotated beside it in vermilion with a gongche pitch symbol. With his right ear he caught the sounds of the Seine, the foghorn of a sightseeing boat, the multilingual exclamations of tourists on the Champ de Mars, the distant rumble of a motorcycle on Boulevard Saint-Germain. These sounds mingled into the eternal sonic fabric of Paris, sounds his left ear would never hear, but his right ear still could. You don't need to come see her off for the exam. And don't let her know you know about me. She still believes her father died years ago in a rehearsal hall fire. Let her keep believing it. Some stage steps are too heavy. They shouldn't press down on her water sleeves alone. Her water sleeves should throw their own wind. He pushed the door open and walked into the vast starlight over the Seine. The tourists on the Champ de Mars were still craning their necks at the Eiffel Tower's display. No one noticed the white-haired, middle-aged man in the dark gray Changshan who passed quietly among them. At the head of the Pont d'Iéna, he paused for a second and looked across the river at the Eiffel Tower. The final line was slowly fading from its facade. In the world of opera, there are only two kinds of people: those who create beauty and those who steal it. Beauty does not lie. Then he turned and followed the embankment into the distance. His right leg left a shallow drag mark on the gravel path. He had called her Xiaoming. When Xiaoming, his daughter. At the time of his fall, she had just started 7th grade. She had inherited his sensitivity to opera. Even as a child, she could tell, in a kumku accompaniment, which bamboo flute's pitch was off, which clapper's rhythm had slipped. Her mother had left them when she was very small, when Bumming had raised her alone. Every time he went to rehearse, he would sit her in the front row center seat and let her watch the uncles and aunties on stage throwing water sleeves, striding, singing the water-grinding melody. She never fussed. She sat there and watched for an entire afternoon. At home afterward, she would mimic the performers in the living room, using her mother's old silk scarves as water sleeves and checking her posture in the reflection of the blank TV screen. Once when came home early and saw her throwing the scarves at the dark screen, her form remarkably good. He stood in the doorway and watched for a long time, then walked in, knelt down, and retied the scarves around her wrists with a proper quick-release knot. He said, "Silk scarves are too light. One of these days, Dad will make you a real pair of rehearsal water sleeves." She didn't know her father was still alive. She didn't know that the anonymous movement notes she received every month, written in vermilion brush on the back of gongche notation paper, the characters as precise as if engraved, each page correcting a postural deviation from her rehearsals and annotating the correct breathing rhythm and force application in blue, all came from her father. She had bound all the anonymous notes into a volume and written on the title page in pencil, "Thank you, anonymous teacher." That line had been erased and rewritten several times, evolving from crooked pencil strokes into neat fountain pen script. Almost simultaneously with when Bumming's exit, the global opera world was detonated by the news over the next several hours. The content on the Eiffel Tower facade was photographed by countless people and spread exponentially on social media. China's Ministry of Culture and Tourism issued a blistering statement, announcing a comprehensive review of all of Cheng Nianqing's intangible heritage transmission achievements and academic publications. UNESCO announced the revocation of Cheng Nianqing's bearer of intangible cultural heritage title. On multiple combined charges, Cheng Nianqing was sentenced to life imprisonment, with lifelong deprivation of political rights. The vintage kingfisher feather hairpin flower was entered into the collection of the Chinese Opera Museum as evidence, accession number SC 2028, EV0061, with an accompanying label. This hairpin flower originally belonged to Mr. Wen Bumming. It was the first kingfisher headdress piece he gave to his disciple. Wen Bumming did not attend the trial. In his capacity as specially appointed expert advisor to the Chinese National Academy of Arts, he entered Cheng Nianqing's opera culture company to oversee its artistic restructuring. He extracted all the plagiarized performance systems and body movement designs, injecting them into a new institution called Gui Mingkunku Transmission Institute, and donated a portion of the equity to the Opera Education Fund of Wen Xiaoming's high school. All remaining performance systems and body movement designs were made open source, shared for free with public opera companies and educational institutions around the world. The sole condition: any performer who uses these systems must, in the future, teach them for free to the next performer. When Bumming called this the transmission clause, he said Kumku's arias are passed from mouth to heart. A master teaches a disciple without charge, and the disciple must teach their own disciples without charge. Later, the Gui Ming Public Welfare Fund was launched, with initial capital in the billions, all sourced from the profits of Yen Mubai's short of Cheng Nianqing's company. The fund supports opera performers and troops harmed by piracy and improper transmission, as well as grassroots opera educators and folk troops dedicated to traditional opera preservation. The very first beneficiary was an old folk artist who had guarded a shadow puppet troupe in a remote mountain village in the northwest for decades. When Bumming and Yen Mubai drove into the mountains themselves, plane, then train, then bus, and finally hitched a ride on a tractor to reach the village. He sat in that drafty adobe house, watching the old artist color shadow puppets with the crudest of tools, then stood up and said, "Your shadow puppet coloring is wrong. You need to use tung oil, not clear lacquer. Tung oil transmits light, lacquer reflects it." On the spot, he handwrote a supplies list and a skills training plan, signed Gui Ming Fund, when Bumming. The old artist accepted the list, written on the back of an old performance program, looked down at it for a long time, and asked, "Master, what is it you do?" When Bumming thought for a moment and gave an answer that made Yen Mubai, standing beside him, take off his sunglasses and turn away, "I used to sing opera. Now I repair headdresses." Later, that list, written on the back of an old show program, was framed and hung on the main wall of the rebuilt Shadow Puppet Troupe's rehearsal space. Next to the frame hung a vintage kingfisher feather hairpin flower, the one when Bumming had personally repaired and given to the old artist. A handwritten label was affixed to it, "Perform the opera you want to perform." When Bumming. Many more years passed. When Bumming's hair went entirely white. His left ear remained deaf, but with the faint, residual hearing in his right, he could still distinguish the subtlest differences in wind sound produced by different fabrics slicing through the air. He no longer repaired headdresses with his own hands. His main energy went into cultivating the next generation of kunku performers. Every year on the winter solstice, he returned to the water town and stood for a while before the old shop, now converted into the Gui Ming Headdress Repair Memorial. On the door still hung the original hand-painted wooden sign. In one corner, in tiny characters, was a line, "A broken headdress can be repaired. A broken opera soul cannot." Those words were Yen Mubai's. A journalist once asked him to sum up when Bumming. He thought for a moment and said, "He spent his life repairing countless phoenix crowns, and everyone is restored without a visible trace. But there's one thing he's spent most of his life trying to repair and never fully mended." The journalist asked what. Yen said, "The human heart. A heart that's been betrayed is like a torn gongche score. No matter how you patch it, the scars remain." But he's still repairing it. On that winter solstice day, the memorial was crowded with visitors. When Bumming blended into the crowd, wearing an ordinary dark gray changshan and reading glasses, he walked up to the wooden sign, gazed at it through the glass for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the town's everyday bustle. He found the spot where his headdress repair shop had once stood, now a stall selling hand-painted silk fans. He closed his eyes and listened for a very long time to the faint, delicate wind sound of water sleeves slicing through air. It wasn't that anyone was actually throwing water sleeves, it was the sound inside his own mind. That sound had followed him for the greater part of his life. He opened his eyes, pulled the loose leaf, rebound gongche notation book from his pocket, and tilted it toward the rare winter sunlight of Jiangnan. Then he put it away, turned, and walked out of the town. Behind him, the woman at the fan stall was shouting into her phone, "Hurry back and eat. I made your favorite, yanduxian, the pork and bamboo shoot soup." His steps didn't pause, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. It was the relief of finally being able, with peace, to stop smiling. All those silences and wind sounds he had learned in the abyss had now become someone else's melody. That was enough.